Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Debra Soh. Dr. Debra Soh, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yes, very good. Thank you for asking. I really enjoyed your book. I'm really looking forward to getting into the details regarding that. It's become one of those topics which is so inflammatory at the moment. It's nice to see you going at it from a science-led perspective. It might be helpful just to mention before we start a little bit about yourself and sort of talk up your liberal credentials, because I think a lot of people erroneously assume that people writing about this topic or taking an interest in it must be some sort of, far right leaning religious conservative, and that's clearly not the case with you at all. I mean, it's a shame that we have to do this to sort of say, I'm a liberal, please don't shoot me, but I mean, that's entirely true in your case, isn't it?
I definitely would say that I'm a liberal politically, although I don't think it really matters what a person's politics are when it comes to the science and the science of gender or human sexuality. I do think it's interesting that some people will assume right away that I must be very much in favor of traditional gender norms if I do question any of the modern day narratives about gender. But in terms of my, say, academic background, my PhD was using brain imaging techniques to look at paraphilias, which are unusual sexual preferences, which are also known as sexual kinks, essentially. And I used to be a weekly columnist for Playboy. In the book, I talk about how I very much used to identify as feminist, a very hardcore feminist, in fact, but I've since distanced myself from that label because as much as I'm definitely in favor of gender equality, I feel that mainstream feminism really does not promote ideas that are helpful for women or men. And the amount of science denial that is also being promulgated by modern day feminism, I don't think is helpful. And I talk about that in the book. So ultimately, like I said, it doesn't really matter where you fall in the political compass. I think the science should be able to speak for itself. That's really been my goal with my work. And if you look at my writing and the things I say, I will infuriate people. It doesn't really matter which side of the political aisle you're on. So that to me is a sign, hopefully, that a person is not biased.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you made a great point there about science denial, and this is one of these things I used to really enjoy taking pot shots at the political right for. You talk about, let's say, things like evolution, so climate change, things like that, and it seems now that the pendulum swung quite a fair bit to the point where the left are the ones proposing ideas that don't tally up with the scientific consensus or the scientific data. So have we got to a point where that's the reality now?
I think the start of this movement in terms of overturning any previous ideas about gender came from, people get mad when I say good intentions, but I do think so. I think people are naturally empathic. And when you look at something like gender identity has very much been lumped into sexual orientation, and it's being pushed as though it's the same. So sexual orientation is immutable. It's in terms of whether someone is attracted to men or women or both. It cannot be changed. Gender identity is different, though, and especially with what we're seeing. I talk in the book about how for some people who present with gender dysphoria, it's in some cases has actually nothing to do with their gender, but we're not even able to talk about that or question that, even if it is in the best interest of that person, because that's seen as hateful now. And I think it's because people have really latched onto this idea that identity more broadly should be respected and taken at face value, that it's harmful to someone to question that. I think that's probably a big part of it. And also that now being woke, being very much in favor of these progressive ideas about gender, like super far left progressive ideas. I'm definitely not a traditionalist when it comes to gender roles at all. I think if you're gender atypical, I consider myself to be a very much gender atypical woman. I don't think just because you're male or female, you should necessarily have to fit into either box 100%. And that if you're gender nonconforming, that there's something wrong with you or you need to change that. But at the same time, the science denial has gone so far now. I mean, people are pushing these ideas because it does make them, in some ways, look good in the public eye. Their career benefits from that. So I think that's part of it as well. And I'll mention, so with the end of gender, I approached 9 different myths and I lay out all of the science. I include all the citations in the book as to why these particular myths are not true. So things like biological sex and gender are socially constructed, that they're spectrums, that children with gender dysphoria should be supported in transitioning to the opposite sex, that there are no differences between trans women and women who are born women. I talk about how there are sex differences in dating and sex between men and women, and how evolutionary psychology plays a very important role when it comes to our sexual behavior. And I mean, the feedback has been very positive. I think most people, when they give it a chance, they're surprised to see how balanced I am. Many people have said to me, you're very compassionate. And so that means a lot, because I think that's important as well. I think we can talk about this objectively, but also maintain that this information should not be used to justify discrimination against particular groups or people.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really value in your book, and that's why I've been happy to recommend it. And obviously, the full title of which is The End of Gender, Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society. And it's science-led, and it comes from a very compassionate pro-trans rights perspective as well. And one of the things I find when the truth is shone on issues, and it is led with compassion and to the data, it actually does help shift people who think they know it all. I mean, I found I was actually moved on certain issues regarding trans people from reading your work, and whereas I'd already considered myself someone who's quite liberal and compassionate on these topics as well. I suppose with it debunking myths, and in the limited time we've got, I'm going to start with the most controversial one, it seems, and you come down very firmly with a quite clear answer. So how many genders are there, and why?
2. Done.
Okay, done. Thanks for your time. It's been great.
I'll see you later. I mean, I can't believe that this is considered controversial.
Yeah.
It's literally considered, they call it transphobic if you say that there are only 2 genders. So someone who is non-binary identifies as either neither or both, or a little bit more of one than the other, essentially a third gender. So gender fluid, gender queer, although I don't like to use that word because queer to me is still a slur against the gay community. Agender, bigender, gender neutral, those tend to be the most common ones. In the book, I go through an entire litany of different terms that are taken on now for someone who identifies as not female or male. So gender is binary because for 99% of us, our gender is our biological sex, and biological sex is determined by gametes, which are mature reproductive cells. So you have eggs and sperm. There's nothing in between. So biological sex is also binary. And this is the case even for people who are transgender or intersex. This is determined by biological influence. And when I say transgender, previously transgender used to mean someone who identifies more as the opposite sex than their birth sex. So this still exists within a binary because you are less like one and more like the other. But now transgender, the term has started to, the umbrella, so-called umbrella, has spread now to encompass people who are non-binary, who trans people will say, people who've transitioned to a binary sex will say non-binary people have very little in common with us, because in many cases, they don't actually transition. They will just change their haircut and take on different pronouns and call themselves a third gender. And then the umbrella has also encompassed gender nonconforming people. It's branched out to encompass people who cross-dress, who previously would not have considered themselves to be part of the trans community. So I'm not trans, and I don't want it to come across like I'm speaking for transgender people. But from what I've seen, and in terms of what people who have reached out to me say, I have many trans people who reach out to me and thank me for the things I say. I don't think, in my opinion, I don't think it's helpful for us to say that something is backed by science when it's not. So the idea that there are more than 2 genders is not backed by science. I'm perfectly happy to use the pronouns that someone wants me to use, but in many cases, I think there are underlying things going on as to why someone is identifying as a third gender. And those are things that we should talk about, as opposed to just simply saying, okay, whatever you want me to call you is fine, and we're not going to question that. So from what I've seen in many cases, it's people who are born female who do not want to identify as female for whatever reason. In many cases, I'm critical of feminism, but I do think sexism exists to some extent in our society still, and they experience a negative. They have a bad experience because they're female, or they've experienced sexual trauma. They no longer want to identify as female, so then they're going to identify as this other category. And in many cases, they will go on and pursue medical interventions like taking hormones or getting a double mastectomy. And there are long-term repercussions from doing so. And if we simply say, okay, you can do whatever you want, whatever you feel like doing, and we don't question why they're doing that, then that is not going to be a solution. Whatever path they go down is not going to be a solution for them.
Yeah, I mean, your book spends a significant portion talking about the importance of trying to identify why somebody feels the way they do, and how long they felt that way, and try and figure out whether there might be other explanations that might save them the pain and heartache of going down a particular path that they might regret at a later date. But I wondered if it might be worth mentioning, just talking about some of the scientific reasons for legitimate transgenderism, in which you do acknowledge that a significant number of people would be more happier transitioning to a different sex. And what scientific reasons do we have for this? What feels like a growing phenomena in our society?
So, gender dysphoria is backed by scientific research, is backed in the medical research. There's a difference between gender dysphoria and the label transgender, because gender dysphoria is the medical condition. Transgender is a political label that a person can choose to identify as. So, in terms of, well, I talk in the book how I have an issue about people calling children transgender, but that's a bit of an aside. In terms of why transitioning can be beneficial, research has shown that for adults, it can help to alleviate gender dysphoria. It can help to alleviate other mental health issues like depression, anxiety. It can improve sexual functioning in some cases, even. So this meta-analysis, a very large meta-analysis, show this. I'm of the opinion that if you're an adult, it's no one's business to tell you what you can and can't do with your body. And I do think so long as a proper assessment can be done with a mental health professional, then if they give the green light for a transition, then I think someone should be free to do that. I would say the same thing even for pubescent children, so children who've reached puberty who are still struggling with their feelings of gender dysphoria. But the problem is mental health professionals cannot do their job in today's climate. So I would say even for adults, it's murky water, because they're going to be very, very reluctant to tell anyone that they shouldn't transition, because they run the risk of losing their license. In Canada, where I am based in Toronto, we have a law that's about to be passed that's going to actually criminalize any therapy that seeks to understand a child's gender dysphoria. So a mental health professional can run the risk of facing 5 years in prison if they do their job properly. And in terms of what else can I tell you? I mean, there's a statistic that talks about how suicide rates remain high post-transition. The authors of that study specifically say, though, that they feel if the people in the study had not transitioned, they may have fared worse. I think that statistic, I see that used on both sides of the political aisle. So you see people on the right saying that this is a sign that transitioning doesn't work and it shouldn't be allowed for anyone. And people on the left will say this is a sign that transitioning didn't come soon enough. So really any research around gender dysphoria transitioning is so politicized. But I do think it can help people. I mean, I'm about where the data are. And I think, but the thing is, I think the reason why it's become so prominent now, it's beyond social acceptance in terms of why we're seeing such a huge spike in the number of especially young women identifying as the opposite sex or a third gender. I think it's in some ways due to social contagion. And when you talk to young women who have transitioned and then detransitioned, they will tell you that they had other things going on. They either had other mental health issues that should have been taken care of or addressed that would have saved them going down this path of transitioning and then detransitioning. And I'm very much in support of us removing the stigma around transition and around the trans community. And I think transgender people deserve to be treated with love and respect, no different from anybody. But we have to be able to talk about this in a very clear-minded way, because if I think it's also the pendulum, like you're saying, swings so far in the other direction, that previously trans people really did have a difficult time, and they, in terms of getting the care that they deserve and in terms of medical gatekeeping. So now the trend has gone so far in the other direction, saying we don't want to gatekeep at all.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned in your book how supportive you are of gay rights, and I think you even speak of a certain amount of affinity for the gay community in general in terms of friends, experiences, things like that. And obviously you'll know very well that being gay was pathologized in living, memory in recent history, and that the harm that caused to a particular community in their advocacy of rights. And to outsiders looking in, the transgender debate, people who are critical of some of the ideology coming out of it, it kind of whiffs of the same thing a little bit, sort of old dinosaurs who think everything new is just a trend or a fad that'll pass, and they'll soon get swept away by this new progressive movement and fall in line. And how can you reassure people that that's not what's happening here? We're not seeing this sort of just pure open rejection of something new because it's new and we don't quite understand it yet.
Because all of the research that we currently have that existed before this issue became so hotly politicized, so basically flies in the face of what activism is saying. So if we're saying with young children, if all of the studies are saying that these kids are going to outgrow how they feel by puberty, it doesn't make sense for them to transition. Whereas something like being gay, I mean, as the research continued on and people better understood why people are gay, it has been shown that it is biological and it's not something that can be changed. And it has been shown that being gay is not something that can be, quote unquote, learned, I guess, because I guess there was some concern that if you let kids be around gay people, I mean, I grew up in the gay community. As you said, I'm a huge supporter of gay rights. So I'm still very sensitive to any sort of negative ideas about gay people. But say if someone who does believe that children can learn being gay from gay adults, and that was why people would say, okay, we can't allow whatever silly ideas they had, that they use that as justification for. I mean, doesn't bear out. Me personally, I wouldn't have an issue. I mean, I joke all the time with my friends that I wish if I have kids one day, I hope that they'll be gay. So I don't really have a problem with that. But what it comes down to really is just the fact that with the modern day trans rights movement, it's completely denying the science. And that's what my issue is. If new studies were coming out, so the thing is, new studies are going to come out and they're definitely going to be in favor of the activism, because there's no way those studies are going to get published today if they don't. And I talk in the book about many examples where you have research either being pulled or reviewed for a second time, which is completely unheard of. And you have academics having their professional and personal reputations tainted as a result of doing good research because it upsets certain groups. So if legitimate research were to come out to say, actually, this is best for kids, early transitioning is best for kids, then I would change my mind. And I initially thought actually that made the most sense, because before I studied sexology, which is the scientific study of sex and gender, I also thought that early transitioning was the best way forward. And it's when I started reading the studies and learning more about the issue that I realized that that's actually not the case. Because people will say young children who do a social transition, so they just change their clothing and they take on a new name, that's harmless because they can detransition anytime. There are no medical interventions. But socially transitioning is actually associated with going on and pursuing medical interventions.
I mean, you talk a lot in your book about the issue we have with going back to how a lot of these things are politically motivated, about attempts to deplatform you, protest, things like that, venue changes last minute, which are things I've experienced when talking publicly. And you'd assume that we were holding KKK rallies, something insane like that, given the reaction to some of the talks I've been at. And you've shared this amusing anecdote where the venue that you find as a replacement is actually a church, and it seems like the last place imaginable to have such a discussion. But we are finding more and more now that whether or not we like it, the people who seem to be getting behind freedom of expression or open discussion are often people who have ideologies that don't necessarily tally with the traditional liberal perspective. And I was just wondering, does that concern you at all, to the point where the only platforms people speaking on this topic might be granted are platforms that are considered typically right-leaning?
It does concern me, not in the context. I mean, I have many friends and colleagues who are conservative. I have no issue with working with conservatives, but it concerns me because this should not be a political issue. Any of this stuff about gender should not be partisan. It really, if we are denying science and if we are creating policies, social policies, medical policies around information that is not fact-based and not true, they're not going to be helpful. They're not going to be effective. And essentially essentially, they're going to be harming people. So when my book came out, my book's been out since August. When I think of, I've done a number of media appearances, and quite literally, I think only 2 of the shows I've been on have been hosted by people who are left-leaning. So for the most part, liberal media has completely ignored my book, and they pretend that it doesn't exist. And I think it's quite funny because most of these outlets will say that they are very much in favor of someone who's female and someone who's an ethnic minority being given a platform and boosted up and helping marginalized voices and et cetera. But when you don't think the right way, you don't count in terms of their ticking the identity politics boxes. So that was a bit disappointing. And because then people will say, well, you are only consorting with one side of the political aisle. You must be biased. And I'm thinking, I don't have, what am I supposed to do? This information needs to be heard. This is affecting children. This is affecting everybody. And so I'm going to speak to whoever's going to be willing to speak with me. And I think I'm happy to speak to different audiences too, because I think in some ways I probably challenge their minds as well, because I think people can sometimes have a view of liberals that's a caricature, because what you see is such a far left progressive orthodoxy that most liberals, I'm not sure if you feel the same way, but I'm not on board with that stuff, and I don't want those people to speak for us. So I feel it's important to be able to engage with everybody.
Yeah, I think social media has a lot to answer for in the way it amplifies minority voices. You know, the loudest voices on this, the most antagonistic, appear to be the loons, for want of a better phrase. But I mean, you mentioned in your book as well, Joe Biden, now President-elect Joe Biden, depending on how deep you've gone down conspiratorial rabbit holes on Twitter. Another reason to stay off Twitter. However, you mentioned the fact that he's said comments in the past to the tune of those going into prison, if they're transgender, should go in with the population of the gender that they identify with. And obviously you take issue with that. And I'm just wondering what are your reasons for taking issue with that, and how big of an issue is this in terms of separating people out by gender in our prison population, do you think?
Well, it's very important because as someone who has worked previously with sex offenders, both clinically and in research, sex offenders are very antisocial and they lie. I would say 99%, or if not 100% of the things coming out of their mouth are lies. And yes, there might be someone who is in prison who genuinely experiences gender dysphoria, and that should be taken seriously. But at the same time, it seems like proper assessment has been completely taken out of this equation. So as a psychologist, if you sit down with someone who is a convicted sex offender and you are trying to determine what is their risk of reoffending, you need to be able to do that in an unbiased way. And if what they're saying about, say, gender needs to be taken at face value and you're going to house them with women, you're basically putting all of these women at risk of sexual abuse, as we've seen. And this is not just a fringe policy. I believe in California, this is what they're actually enacting now. And it's just beyond me, because I think this is an extreme form of this ideology, but it's a sign of how entrenched it's becoming in our society. I'm hoping that when Biden said that he really was just pandering, but we see this actually happening. So it's very concerning. And I think most people who aren't following this, they're going to look at someone in a position of authority and power and say, well, if they're okay with it, I guess I should be okay with it too. Most people are not like myself or you, who are following the culture war and fighting back against this. And so that's another goal with the book. I was really trying to speak to the average person who is not following these issues so closely, because they're being told a lot of information that's completely incorrect. And unless you have the time to actually go and look up the studies and read them instead of reading, say, the news coverage or seeing how people talk about it in political commentary, you wouldn't know, because it is so biased. And so in the book, I do include all of the citations, all the studies that I talk about, so that people can look it up if they're interested to learn more. And then if you're debating with people in your life, you can also say, well, look at this study. This is why biological sex is not a spectrum. This is why there are only two genders.
Yeah, it is very helpful, and it does touch upon a lot of the big, quote unquote, controversial talking points that are making it into the mainstream news and the general discussion. One thing you spend a significant portion of time on is the idea of detransitioning, which seems to be a growing thing, which is also going underreported because it kind of contradicts the prominent left-wing narrative on this issue. And I was just wondering, how big of an issue is detransition? How common is it, would you say? And do you think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future? And will this lead to potential lawsuits, in your view?
There's a study that suggests detransitioning exists in about 2% of people who transition. This was a Swedish study, but this study was done long before this current peak or this influx that we're seeing of young people who are suddenly identifying as the opposite sex. So we don't have those data yet. I do think it's going to be a huge, huge issue. People right now will say that detransitioners that it's so statistically rare that it doesn't matter, or that those people were never really gender dysphoric. But when you talk to these young women, they will tell you their feelings were real. They were genuinely suffering, and there's other things going on in their life that that were not addressed, as I mentioned. So I do think there are going to be major repercussions. There are going to be lawsuits. We already see this happening in the UK, as I'm sure you've heard of that one case with Kira Bell. And I think that's really what it's going to take for people to take this seriously. Because right now, if you talk about detransitioners, my heart goes out to them so much because they are not taken seriously at all. Some of them are living with permanent side effects of these interventions. Some of them had hysterectomy. Some of them had their ovaries taken out, and they're now 20 something years old, and they're saying, what did I do? And no one will listen to them. Medical professionals don't know how to treat them because they see it as, one, they're afraid because if they do engage with them, that could be seen as not affirming a person, so they run the risk of losing their license. And also, I think in some ways they just don't have the training, or they don't know how to deal with this population now because it is so new to some extent. So those of us who speak out, we get called all kinds of names. I see that changing. I see the experts, so-called experts, who are pushing this right now, who claim that detransitioners don't exist and call someone like myself bigoted. They're going to turn around and they're going to pretend that they had no idea that this was coming.
Yeah, and that is tragic, really. Like as you say, and you spend a significant portion of the book as well talking about people who may be a little bit confused in their identity, may just be a masculine female or a feminine male, and assume that indicates they'd be prefer to be a different sex. And I'm just wondering, how young are people when they're starting to be encouraged to go down the route of transitioning? How young can it happen, really?
It's in the education system. So as soon as your kids get into school, they're going to be exposed to these ideas. Gender clinics are seeing children as young as age 3, which to me is way too young. Yeah. And I think it really is going to take a serious effort on the part of parents and adults who are not in favor of this to push back, because kids don't know any better. When they're being exposed to ideas like gender fluidity, or that if they are a boy but they like dolls, that means they're not really boys, that they should be girls, or maybe they're a third gender, that to me is absolutely nonsensical. And in many cases, parents don't know that this is what's being taught in the curriculum, because what they're receiving on paper, it does not reflect what teachers are actually saying in the classroom. So I think it's really important. In the book, I talk about a bunch of different ways that parents can seek to push back and prevent this from happening in terms of the indoctrination of their kids, and just to not be afraid to rock the boat, and not be afraid to ask questions, and not be afraid to stick your neck out, because at the end of the day, those are your kids, that's your business.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I'm aware you've got to be somewhere else soon, so I suppose I'll just ask one final thing, and that's on the issue of pronouns. And regardless of whether or not that's useful in society, I've noticed it appears to be a red flag on social media. It seems to correlate with some of the the highest levels of lunacy and vitriol and abuse that comes your way. It's there's going to be a study on this one day, I'm sure, but you note some actual genuine and thoughtful issues as to why announcing your pronouns at the beginning of a conversation isn't actually the best thing to do for trans people. Maybe you could just explain that.
I see the pronouns in the bio, or the pronouns in the email signature, or wherever else, as a way that someone is trying to signal their virtuousness and their progressive values. It has nothing to do with what's actually good for the trans community, because most trans people will tell you they do not want to have to announce their pronouns at the start of any interaction, because then that suggests that their transition was not obvious. It's insulting to them. And I understand why it would be insulting to them. And in many cases, it's straight, non-transgender people. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, do you even care about what's good for the community? Yeah. It's like, I talk in the book about people who identify as queer. And as I mentioned, to me, queer is still a slur, and I won't use that term. But there was a study that actually looked at people who identify that way, and they are straight, wealthy women who are well educated. And I'm thinking, if you look at their sexual history, all of their sexual partners have been men. So they're not even slightly bisexual, they're straight. And so I'm thinking, this is a way for people to get more points in terms of the intersectional hierarchy than it is about the community they claim to be concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's wonderful that we have so much freedom now to identify and live the life we want to, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to redefine concepts or change certain things in institutions. Dr. Debra Soh, thank you very much for speaking to me. I really enjoyed your book. It's something I'm very confident in recommending to friends and family and other people, because you come at it from a really, data-driven scientific perspective, and I think that's really needed in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And then also thank you for defending me on social media, because I see trolls trying to drag my name around and you get in there. So I appreciate it.
No problem. Anytime. It's what I do. Take care. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye now.